Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Confederate Reckoning, Power and Politics in the Civil War South by Stephanie Mccurry. Narrated by Teri Schnaubelt. Prologue. The Confederate Project. Something stunning, epic even, transpired in the American South between 1860 and 1865. Then, in a gamble of world historical proportions, a class of slaveholders, flush with power, set out to build an independent pro-slavery nation, but instead brought down the single most powerful slave regime in the Western world and propelled the emergence of a new American republic that redefined the very possibilities of democracy at home and abroad. In the process, too, they provoked precisely the transformation of their own political culture they had hoped to avoid by secession, bringing into the making of history those people, the South's massive unfranchised population of white women and slaves, whose political dispossession they intended to render permanent. The story of the Confederacy is a story of intentions, reversals, undoing, and unlikely characters that form an arc of history rarely matched for dramatic interest and historical justice. The short-lived Confederate States of America was a single event in the history of the Western world. What secessionists set out to build was something entirely new in the history of nations, a modern pro-slavery and anti-democratic state dedicated to the proposition that all men were not created equal. Confederates were fully caught up in the turbulent currents of history that roiled the hemisphere in the age of emancipation. Their pro-slavery experiment was part of a far larger struggle than being waged over slavery, democracy, and the powers of nation-states. Theirs was a nation founded in defiance of the spirit of the age, emboldened by the failure of emancipation in other parts of the hemisphere, convinced that the American vision of the people had been terribly betrayed. Southern slaveholders sought the kind of future for human slavery and Republican government no longer possible within the original Union. Theirs was to be a republic perfectly suited to them as a slaveholding people, a republic of white men, defined by slavery and the political exclusion of the mass of the Southern people. It was a risky undertaking, to say the least. Even in the absence of war, a distinctly looming possibility, the political demands of independence were daunting. The South was a particular, some would have said peculiar, place, a territory of 900,000 square miles and 15 separate slaveholding states. It would be no mean feat to unite it behind secession and independence. Of its 12 million people, 4 million were enslaved and disfranchised, and another 4 million, free white women, were formally citizens but possessed of none of the political rights or privileges of their male compatriots. Secessionists worried openly about non-slaveholders, about how to secure the support of the region's white male population of voters and citizens who owned no slaves. And well, they might have. The campaign to get the South out of the Union would offer a painfully public demonstration of how difficult it was to unify even white men behind the Confederate project. But what of the 8 million other Southerners who were never consulted about the wisdom of secession, national independence, or war? Would they remain nullities in the momentous events unfolding in the American South? Still, this was the Confederate project. To build a nation, perhaps in war, while winning the support of the majority of white Southerners who were not slaveholders, nullifying the individual and collective agency of women, and holding much of the population in slavery. It is hard to exaggerate the drama of what unfolded in the Confederacy when its founders were free to pursue this reactionary dream. One of the most compelling parts of that story was the trial of its national vision by its own people in the war. Confederates' pro-slavery and anti-democratic experiment was tested at every point, not just by the enemy armies arrayed against them, but by the very people the founders had so definitively counted out. For, as it turned out, the vision of the people, so passionately pursued, proved utterly inadequate to the nation-building project Confederate architects undertook. The crisis of legitimacy unleashed in Southern life was not confined to matters of culture and ideology, but played out decisively in the arena of politics and policy as the chrysalis state confronted and attempted to surmount the structural problems inevitably faced by a slave regime at war. Within months of secession, the fledgling CSA was at war. In attempting to escape history, Confederates had lowered themselves into its most dangerous currents. War immeasurably upped the ante in the new white man's republic and subjected its body politic to the kind of test few modern slave regimes willingly hazarded. As the new government turned to its white citizens to support and defend the bid for national independence, it faced the necessity of building support, too, among those whose consent for secession, nationhood, and war it had never solicited. Then began a relentless process in which government officials and military men, all the way up the chain of command, scrambled to execute policies designed to build a state and wage war, while preserving slavery and feeding and protecting a civilian population of women increasingly denied the support of their men. Then the slaveholders got a hard lesson in the political powers of the Confederate unfranchised. There would be far more of the people to contend with in the making of history in the Civil War South than the founders ever bargained on. The struggle with the non-slaveholders was expected, and it exacted its price. But nobody expected to have to contend with the women. White women, although citizens, were not a population that figured in anybody's political calculations. Women had never been of much interest to state officials. As a matter of law and custom, they were regarded, like Antigone, as outside politics and war, members of the household under the governance of husbands and fathers. But war had barely begun when officials on both sides were thrown into a series of confrontations with women engaged in what could only be called political acts, forcing fundamental recalculations about loyalty, treason, and political clout. As war exacted its toll and old assumptions crumbled, politicians and military men in the Civil War South ended up contending with the women, even, some charged, making war on women. In the occupied South, Union forces struggled to limit the damage done by Confederate women and were eventually forced to recognize them as enemies in war. Women would be required to take oaths of allegiance, subjected to Union court-martial, and clapped in prison. In the heart of their own national territory, the mass of white Southern women emerged as formidable adversaries of their own government in the long struggle over the military policies of the CSA. Pushed into a newly intimate relationship to state authorities and embracing a new identity as soldiers' wives, they forged a politics of subsistence by which to claim entitlement and demand justice. By insisting that the state live up to its promises and protect and support them, even taking up arms to do so, the women, poor white rural women with no previous history of political participation, defied notions about their incapacity and irrelevance to step decisively into the making of history. If the new political assertiveness of Southern women did not bring down the Confederacy, it did represent a powerful challenge to the Confederate vision of the people and the Republic, and speaks to the particular pressures and ruptures of war in slave society. Any state that took their men would ultimately have to answer to them. More critical still was the way the problem of slaves' political allegiance, a problem that had troubled Thomas Jefferson from the birth of the Republic, reared up decisively in the face of Confederate politicians, policymakers, and military men, forcing them into a constant confrontation with slaves' own political objectives in the war. The idea that a republic could be built in war without contending with the political desires of 4 million slaves strikes moderns as fantastic. But Confederates' hubris on this account is stunning, especially given the troubling hemispheric history in which they operated. For the relationship between war and emancipation weighed heavily on every slave power in the 19th century. Since the late 18th century, slave regimes at war and chronically short...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?